Moving to Massachusetts felt like a fresh start for me. After months of trying to get over the divorce, all I wanted was a little peace and solitude. So when I found an old house in a small rural town, it seemed like the perfect choice. It was one of those classic 19th century houses, with a charming facade and a sense of history etched into every brick. The kind of place that, to anyone, would seem filled with memories. When I first arrived, the neighborhood seemed welcoming. Large houses, all spaced far apart, surrounded by huge trees that gently swayed in the wind. The silence was almost deafening, especially for someone who had spent their whole life in a big city. But that silence was exactly what I was looking for. I just wanted some tranquility to get my life back on track. The first few days were normal. I spent my time organizing the house, unpacking boxes, and adjusting to the new routine. The neighborhood was exactly as it seemed. Calm, with few visible residents, but everyone was polite enough to wave when they passed by in their cars. I used to take walks around the area, observing the old trees and the houses spaced along the street. There was something comforting in the idea of being alone, as if the world had paused for a while just for me. But at night, everything changed. At first, it was small things. The living room light switch would flicker slightly, which I assumed was the fault of the old electrical system. The floor creaked with the wind, like it was settling, as they say. Then I started noticing something more. Footsteps. At night, when I was in the bedroom, always around 2 a.m., I would hear soft footsteps upstairs. Always at the same time, always the same pattern, as if someone was slowly walking around up there. At first, I didn't pay much attention. I thought maybe it was the wind or the typical noises of an old house. But as the nights went on, the sound started to intensify. It was as if the footsteps were getting louder, heavier, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, they seemed to come closer to my bedroom each night. The feeling that something was wrong began to gnaw at me. That house, which seemed so welcoming and peaceful during the day, took on a completely different atmosphere at night. The shadows seemed darker, and the silence that once brought me peace now made me uncomfortable, as if something was lurking in the dark. No matter how much I tried to rationalize it, something told me I needed to investigate. But at the same time, there was a part of me that preferred not to know what I might find. In the third week, the footsteps became impossible to ignore. They were no longer noises I could attribute to the wind or the old floors. They were clear, firm footsteps, as if someone was walking directly above me, always at the same time, and it started to deeply unsettle me. I knew I needed to investigate, but part of me hesitated. Maybe it was the fear of finding out I was alone, or worse, finding out I wasn't. That night, around 2 a.m., the footsteps began again. I was lying in bed, trying to ignore them as I always did, but this time the sound was louder. It felt like the person, or whatever it was walking directly toward my bedroom. A chill ran down my spine, and I couldn't stay still any longer. I grabbed my flashlight and, with heavy breaths, headed toward the attic. The attic was at the end of the hallway, with a narrow wooden staircase that creaked with every step. The house felt even more silent as I approached. When I finally reached the entrance, I found something I had never noticed before. A door. It was a small, old wooden door, hidden in the corner, almost invisible under the shadows of the low ceiling. What struck me most was that it was locked. I had never seen it before, and now it was there, blocking my way. I shined the flashlight on the lock and the cracked wood, looking for a key, but found nothing. There was something about the way the door was there, as if it had been hiding something for a long time. It was impossible to deny the discomfort that washed over me. The footsteps had stopped since I'd come up, but the house was eerily quiet now, as if it were waiting for something. I decided not to force the door that night. I went back to my bedroom, but the discomfort lingered. The next day, I started searching the house for any key or clue that might help me open that door. I reorganized drawers, cabinets, and even the old furniture that had been there when I moved in. Nothing. Then, behind a dusty painting in the hallway, I found something that looked like it had been hidden for a long time. It was a small metal box, locked, with rusted details on the sides. My heart raced. The feeling that something big was about to be revealed took over me. With trembling hands, I opened the box. Inside, I found old photos. They were black and white, showing a family, father, mother, and two children, probably taken in the 1950s. At first, it seemed like a happy family, but as I looked closer, I noticed something very wrong in the photos. The children's expressions were strange, as if they were forcing smiles. Their eyes, however, didn't show joy. They showed fear. I kept looking through the photos, and the more I saw, the more uncomfortable I felt. In all of them, there were shadows in the background, distorted, as if something was lurking around the family. And then came the last photo. The same family, but this time the children were crying, with handprints on the windows behind them. The feeling of dread washed over me. Something was wrong with that house. Something the family seemed to know, and somehow it now involved me too. That night, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. Something about those photos, the terrified eyes of the children, and the distorted shadows wouldn't leave me in peace. There was a story hidden in that house, and somehow I was already part of it. The thought haunted me. If I did nothing, I would end up like them. Maybe it was paranoia, but something in me said there was a dark truth behind that attic door, and I had to find out what it was. With a toolbox in hand, I went up to the attic once again. The stairs creaked as before, but this time I was determined. I placed the flashlight on the floor and began working on the locked door. The wood was old, and with a few knocks, the rusted lock gave way. The creak of the door opening was like a muffled scream echoing through the empty attic. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open, revealing what seemed to be a small hidden room. The room was dusty, untouched for decades. In the center of the room was an old wooden chest, equally covered in dust. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the silence was total. Every fiber of my being wanted to run, but my curiosity was stronger. I knew something important was in there. With trembling hands, I opened the chest. Inside, I found a series of diaries. They belonged to the mother of the family from the photos. The pages were yellowed and fragile, but still readable. I began to read, and soon the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The family that had lived there decades ago had been haunted by a malevolent presence. It all started with small signs. Noises, doors that locked themselves, strange shadows. They tried to ignore it, believing it was just the old house speaking, as I had. But over time, the presence grew stronger, taking over the house, until they realized they were no longer alone. The diary described the feeling of being trapped, unable to leave the house. The mother wrote about the entity that seemed to manipulate their minds, trapping them in a cycle of terror. The final entry was the most disturbing. "We are trapped. Someone must break the cycle, or this will never end." As soon as I finished reading, I felt a chill run down my spine. At that moment, the footsteps in the attic started again. But this time, they weren't just above me. They were all around me. The air grew heavy, and the sensation that I wasn't alone intensified. It felt like 1,000 invisible eyes were watching me, waiting for something. Suddenly, the flashlight began to flicker. The sound of the footsteps became frantic, as if someone or something was running around me. I grabbed the flashlight and ran for the door, but it was locked again. Desperation took over as I pounded on the door, trying to open it. Then the flashlight went out completely, leaving me in total darkness. In the silence, I heard whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but they came from all directions. The air seemed to close in around me, as if the house itself was alive, swallowing me whole. I was trapped, just like the family before me. Somehow, I managed to force the door open and run out of the attic. I stumbled down the stairs, my heart racing. When I reached the ground floor, I heard a deafening sound coming from the attic, the chest slamming shut, followed by a deathly silence. I knew something had been released, something I couldn't see, but that was watching me. In the following days, I tried to continue living in the house, but the feeling of being watched never left. The footsteps continued, growing closer, more desperate. And now I understand. The family in those photos was consumed by the presence, and I am destined for the same fate. I thought about selling the house, but I feel it wouldn't be enough. Something tells me that wherever I go, this entity will follow. It feeds on fear, on despair. And now I am trapped in the same cycle that the mother of that family wrote about in her diary. The house is quiet tonight, but I know soon the footsteps will start again. And this time, I don't know if I'll be able to escape. Since I moved to Vermont, everything seemed calmer. My house, an old Victorian-style building, was located on a quiet street, surrounded by trees and with few nearby homes. After the end of my relationship, this house became my refuge. I spent my days redecorating the rooms, trying to give the place a more personal touch, something that reflected my new life, solitary but more my own. Last Saturday, I decided to explore the town's flea market. It was small but full of intriguing and old items, as if each carried a story. Among piles of old furniture and knickknacks, my eyes landed on a mirror. It wasn't just any mirror. Its frame was ornate, golden, with sculpted floral details, and the glass, slightly tarnished by time, reflected a soft glow under the market's dim light. Something about that mirror attracted me, though I couldn't quite say what it was. It felt as though it belonged to me somehow. I asked the vendor, an elderly man with eyes that seemed to observe everything from afar, how much it cost. He gave me a strange look before muttering the price. Still, I bought it. Back at home, I decided to hang it in the living room, right above the fireplace. The golden frame softly gleamed against the bluish walls, as if it had been made to be there. I thought it would be the perfect finishing touch to the room. For the first few days, everything seemed normal. The mirror quickly became part of the decor, something I passed by without paying much attention to. The house looked prettier, and my quiet, predictable daily routine was exactly what I needed at that moment. But at night, things changed. The first time I noticed something strange, I was adjusting the curtains beside the mirror. When I looked into the reflection, I noticed the light seemed slightly distorted. It was as though something was wrong with the reflection of the room. I looked closer, but couldn't identify exactly what was bothering me. Maybe it was the age of the glass, I thought. After all, it was an old mirror. I ignored that uncomfortable feeling, convincing myself it was just the effects of time on the object. But, night after night, the discomfort grew. Every time I passed by the mirror, I felt a slight pressure, as if something was watching me, even though I was alone in the house. On the fifth night, I realized what was truly wrong. While brushing my hair in front of the mirror, I noticed my reflection seemed delayed. I moved my arm, and the reflection took a fraction of a second longer to follow. I froze for a moment, staring intently at the mirror, hoping my eyes were playing tricks on me. But the reflection continued to be slightly out of sync, as if something or someone behind that glass was imitating my movements, but not perfectly. I averted my eyes, feeling my heart race. It wasn't possible. It was just a mirror, right? I turned off the lights and went to bed, trying to forget what had happened. But that strange feeling stayed with me all night, as if something was watching me while I slept. Days passed, but the strange feeling that something was wrong with the mirror wouldn't leave me. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just paranoia, or that the light in the room was somehow distorting the image. After all, it was an old mirror. Perhaps the glass was worn with age. But every time I passed by it, the discomfort grew. It was as if the mirror was watching me. One night, while getting ready for bed, something unexpected happened. I was sitting on the living room sofa, the mirror directly in front of me. I wasn't looking directly at it, but the reflection called to me, as if an invisible force was pulling me to look at it. I felt the air in the room change, becoming heavier. I hesitated for a moment before giving in to the urge to look. My eyes went straight to the reflection, and that's when I saw it. The reflection seemed different. I was sitting there on the sofa, but my image in the mirror wasn't exactly the same. It was sitting like me, wearing the same dress, with the same hair, but the expression in the mirror seemed focused on me, not on the room. My reflection was staring at me. Frozen, I watched for a few more seconds, hoping my eyes were deceiving me. But no, the image in the mirror seemed to be looking back at me, with an expression I didn't recognize as my own. I took a deep breath, feeling my heart race. I had to be imagining things. I quickly stood up, diverting my gaze from the mirror, and walked toward the hallway, trying to convince myself that it was all in my imagination. Maybe I was exhausted and I needed to sleep. But the truth was, since the mirror arrived in my home, something seemed to be changing. That night, before going to sleep, I made a decision. I grabbed a sheet, and covered the mirror. It was no longer a decoration piece. It had become a source of anxiety. I slept better that night, with the sense that the distorted reflection was finally out of sight. But deep down, I knew that wouldn't solve the problem. The next morning, when I went downstairs to the living room, I saw that the sheet was on the floor. The mirror was exposed again. I froze, feeling a chill run down my spine. I was sure I had covered it before bed, but there it was, gleaming under the morning light. For a moment, I thought I might have forgotten to secure the sheet properly, but something inside me knew that wasn't the case. During the day, I carried on with my usual activities, trying not to think too much about the mirror. But every time I passed by it, I avoided looking directly. It felt as though if I looked too long, something terrible would happen. That's when I started noticing something else. Even when I wasn't facing the mirror, I felt like I was being watched. Whenever I was in the living room, the presence was palpable, as if my reflection was alive, waiting for a moment to act. That night, the discomfort turned into real fear. I was sitting on the sofa again, watching TV, when suddenly, I felt a light breeze pass through the room. As if someone had walked by me, I looked around, startled. The window was closed. There was no way the wind could have entered. I took a deep breath and glanced at the mirror. My heart stopped for a second. The reflection of the sofa was empty. I was sitting there, but in the mirror, there was no one on the sofa. It was as though the reflection was waiting for me, somewhere more distant, out of my control. Panic rose in my throat. I jumped up, turned off the TV, and ran to the bedroom, slamming the door behind me. That night, I slept with the lights on. But even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that, behind that door in the living room, the mirror was somehow preparing for something much worse. I woke up in the middle of the night with a strange sensation. The room was silent, but something in the air felt dense, heavy. I looked at the clock on my nightstand. It was 3 a.m., the infamous witching hour, as they say. A chill ran down my body. The lights were still on, but that didn't lessen the feeling that something was profoundly wrong. I tried to convince myself to go back to sleep, but I couldn't ignore the feeling of being watched. The mirror. It was the mirror. Down in the living room, covered or not, it kept affecting me in ways I couldn't explain. I took a deep breath and decided I had to put an end to it. I needed to get rid of the mirror, destroy it, anything that would bring me peace. I got out of bed, trying to ignore the growing fear, and quickly went downstairs. When I reached the living room, I stopped in front of the mirror. The sheet I had used to cover it was, once again, on the floor. The mirror gleamed under the soft light of the lamp, reflecting the entire room, but the familiar discomfort intensified. My reflection was there, still, staring at me. But something was wrong, more wrong than before. The reflection wasn't following my movements. I was standing in the middle of the room, but the image in the mirror was different. My eyes were vacant, fixed on me in a way that made me shudder. I began to walk back and forth, observing closely. Nothing in the reflection changed. It was frozen, staring at me, not following any of my movements. A dark thought crossed my mind. The thing in the mirror wasn't me. Or at least, it wasn't what it should have been. Gripping the hammer I had brought with me, I approached the mirror, determined to end this. The air around me grew colder, as if an invisible presence had taken over the room. My eyes were locked on the reflection that wasn't mine. As I raised the hammer, ready to smash it, the image in the mirror finally moved, but not in the way I expected. My reflection smiled. I froze. The smile was distorted, cruel, something I knew I would never do. The image raised a hand, as if beckoning me, and before I could react, it moved closer to the glass, as if about to cross through it. My heart raced, and in a pure panic, I swung the hammer with all my strength at the mirror. The sound of shattering glass was deafening. The mirror exploded into hundreds of fragments, falling to the floor like a rain of glittering shards. Panting, I stepped back, hoping the nightmare had ended. But something was still wrong. Very wrong. The glass shards on the floor still reflected the smile. Every tiny fragment of the mirror showed the same image of me, smiling that twisted, macabre grin. Even broken, the mirror hadn't freed me. The reflection was still there, scattered in pieces, but as present as ever. I started hearing whispers from all directions. They echoed through the room, growing louder until I could barely make out words. The lights began to flicker, and the feeling of being trapped in a nightmare from which I couldn't escape became overwhelming. I ran to the living room door, trying to leave, but it was locked, though I had never locked it. Suddenly, I felt something move behind me. Slowly, I turned my head to the shattered pieces on the floor. And there it was, the worst possible sight. A figure was forming from the shards. The distorted image of my reflection was now materializing, as if emerging from the broken glass, taking shape and coming to life in the real world. I backed away, terrified, but I knew it was too late. The reflection was now outside the mirror, standing before me with that grotesque smile that seemed to crave something. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The lights finally went out completely, leaving me in the dark with the entity. What happened next is hard to describe. I felt a wave of cold wash over me, and the last thing I remember is the reflection, my distorted copy, reaching out as if to pull me to the other side. The next morning I woke up on the living room floor, surrounded by the mirror's fragments. It was still dark, but the atmosphere seemed calm. I got up with difficulty, looking around. The figure had disappeared, but the feeling that something was terribly wrong remained. When I looked at a small shard of glass near my foot, I saw my reflection again. This time, I wasn't smiling. Living alone was never a problem for me. In fact, it was one of the reasons I moved to this old house in a small town in Ohio. Remote work gave me the freedom to do so, and after years of cramped apartments, the idea of a spacious house seemed like a dream. The neighborhood was quiet, and the house, though old, had charm. With its creaky wooden floors and a staircase leading to an attic I barely explored, the place felt ideal. My routine was simple. I woke up early, worked until the afternoon, and in the evenings, I would settle down with a book or a series, letting the silence of the house fill the void. But something began to bother me. Every time I returned from work or a quick outing, I would hear the distinct sound of a door locking. At first, I thought it was the wood adjusting or the house reacting to the elements. Old houses make noises, right? But the frequency and pattern of the sound started to make me suspicious. It was always the same sound, the soft click of a door closing and locking. I would rush to check the doors, but they were all exactly as I had left them. None locked from the inside, no key in the lock. The house was intact, with no signs of a break-in or anything out of place. I started to wonder if I was imagining things. Maybe it was the echo of my own movements when I left, somehow bouncing back through the walls. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more constant the sound became. Every night, around the same time, there it was again, the unmistakable click, echoing through the silent house, coming from somewhere I couldn't pinpoint. It was as if someone or something was locking a door on its own, but I could never figure out which door it was. The sound seemed to come from all directions, resonating through the empty halls. The feeling that something wasn't right started to grow inside me. It wasn't just the sound of the door, but the way the air seemed to change when I heard it. The atmosphere became heavier, as if the house was watching me, waiting to see what I would do. The discomfort that was initially easy to ignore began to seep into me, becoming more present, harder to shake. But that night, the sound was different, louder, clearer. And when I ran to check, I noticed something that made me freeze. Every door in the house, all the ones I was sure I had closed, were now open. Somehow, without me noticing, the entire house seemed exposed, as if inviting something in. The sight of all the doors open paralyzed me for a moment. Each one, which I was sure I had shut before leaving, was now ajar. The hallway of the house, which once felt cozy, now had a sinister air, as if some invisible force had passed through, opening everything in its path. The click of the door I had been hearing every day suddenly made more sense, but that only added to my discomfort. I walked slowly down the hall, pushing the doors closed again, one by one. Each movement felt heavier than usual. The sound of the hinges echoed through the silence, making the atmosphere even more oppressive. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I reached the last door, the one leading to the attic. I rarely went up there. I didn't see the need. It was just a space full of boxes and dust, a place I wasn't interested in exploring. However, that night the door seemed different. It wasn't just ajar, it seemed locked. Something inside me hesitated to touch the handle, as if part of me already knew something was wrong. My fingers trembled as I finally gripped the handle. I pushed lightly, but the door didn't budge. It was firm, as if someone had locked it from the inside. I took a step back, feeling cold sweat run down my neck. It didn't make sense. I hadn't locked that door before leaving, so how was it locked now? I tried to rationalize. Old houses have their quirks, maybe the wind, maybe the aging structure, but something told me it wasn't that simple. Something more was happening. I decided it was best not to mess with it that night. I needed answers, but not right then. I closed the other doors in the hallway and went back to the living room. That night was long. I tried watching TV, I tried distracting myself with a book, but the feeling that something was wrong followed me like a shadow. The silence of the house, once comforting, now felt dense, almost suffocating. Every creak, every groan of the walls made me jump. The house seemed alive, as if it was watching, waiting for me to make the next move. When I finally went to bed, I locked myself in. I didn't want to hear that door click again. The last thing I saw before shutting the door was the entrance to the attic, still locked, still silent. I closed my eyes, trying to ignore the feeling that something up there was waiting for me. The next morning, the fear from the previous night seemed a little more distant. Maybe it had just been my mind playing tricks on me. I decided to go up to the attic. I needed to face it head on. I grabbed the key from the cabinet and climbed the narrow staircase. When I reached the attic door, something made me stop. There were marks, scratch marks, deep gouges in the wood, as if someone, or something, had clawed at the door from the inside out. My heart raced, and I felt my breath quicken. I touched the marks, feeling the rough texture of the scratches. Whatever was in there didn't want to be trapped. I stood there, staring at the marks on the attic door, trying to understand what exactly was happening. Each scratch, each mark in the wood, made me feel like I was being watched. Whatever had been trapped in there had fought to get out, and the worst part was the feeling that it was still there. My hands trembled as I grabbed the attic key. Part of me screamed not to open that door, to forget what I had seen and move on with my life. But something stronger, curiosity, or maybe the fear of not knowing, pushed me to go forward. I inserted the key into the lock, hesitated for a moment, then turned it. The metallic sound of the latch unlocking echoed down the empty hallway. I opened the door slowly, each inch revealing a dark, dusty space. The air that rushed out was heavy, as if time had stopped in there. The attic was a small space, filled with old boxes and objects I had never cared to investigate. But something was different. The silence in the air felt thicker. There was a presence, almost palpable. My eyes were drawn to the center of the attic. There was a figure, or rather what was left of a figure, kneeling on the floor. It was a skeletal silhouette, covered in a layer of dust so thick it seemed part of the environment. Its face was turned toward me, but I couldn't make out any details. Just a shadow, lifeless but terrifyingly present. I froze, unable to move. My body screamed to run, but my feet were rooted to the ground. That's when I heard it, not the sound of doors locking, but whispers. Low, hoarse, as if the house itself was speaking to me, or worse, as if the figure inside was trying to communicate. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was clear. Something had been waiting for me, watching, and now I had left the door open. I took a step back, trying to distance myself, but the floor creaked beneath my feet, and the figure in the attic moved. Slowly, with agonizing movements, it began to rise. Every motion seemed painful, as if years of inertia were being broken at that moment. My eyes were locked on it, and I knew I didn't have much time. I slammed the attic door shut, turning the key as fast as I could. Silence returned, but the feeling that something was on the other side, waiting to get out, had never been so intense. I ran downstairs, my heart pounding. The house felt suffocating. The walls that once protected me now seemed like a prison, holding something at bay. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the silhouette in the attic, the whispers echoing in my mind. I knew locking the attic door wasn't the end of it. Something had been awakened, something that had been trapped and now wanted out. In the days that followed, the sounds of doors locking continued. But now, there was more. Shadows that moved through the house, the constant chill in the hallway leading to the attic. No matter what I did, the feeling that something was about to escape grew stronger with each passing day. And deep down, I knew that whatever was in there wouldn't stop until it got out. I was trapped. Trapped in my own home with a mystery I never should have investigated. The attic, once just a forgotten part of the house, had now become the center of my terror. And every night, the sound of the door locking echoed through the house, reminding me that whatever was in there wasn't going to give up easily. When Jack and I moved into that old building in Baltimore, we were looking for a fresh start. The place was exactly what we had imagined. High ceilings, wooden floors that creaked with every step, and large windows that let in the soft morning light. It was one of those classic buildings from a time when details mattered. The building had history. Initially, that's what attracted us. We wanted something with soul, a refuge from the chaos of the city. The first few days were peaceful. Most of the neighbors were elderly, and they seemed to have lived there for decades, all very reserved. It was a small building, which made us feel like we had found a home. However, we soon noticed something strange about the tenant in the basement. No one mentioned him directly. He was an almost invisible presence. Whenever we asked other residents about him, we received vague answers, as if no one wanted to discuss the subject. "Oh, he's been there a long time," they'd say. "Doesn't bother anyone." But no matter how much we tried to make small talk, it was clear that the basement neighbor was some kind of taboo. We never saw him during the day. Only at night, at strange hours. Once, when we were returning from dinner, we saw a figure emerging from the basement. The man was thin, almost skeletal, with pale skin and dressed in dark clothes, as if he were trying to hide in the shadows. He moved with a strange slowness, avoiding any eye contact. Jack and I exchanged glances that night. Something wasn't right. The nights continued like that. I watched from the window, and there he was, always coming out after the sun had set, never during the day. Sometimes he disappeared for hours and returned before dawn, always through the same basement entrance. At first, I thought he might be a recluse, someone who simply had a different schedule than ours. But it didn't take long for that routine to deeply disturb me. Over time, I began to notice other details. No one visited him. No one seemed to interact with him, except for brief glances exchanged in the hallway. More than once, I thought about knocking on the basement door to offer a greeting. Maybe break the ice, but something held me back. It was as if an invisible force told me I shouldn't get involved. Things became even stranger when we started asking the neighbors about him. Simple questions, like how long he had lived there, were met with hazy responses. A long time was all we could get. No one knew for sure, or maybe they did, but didn't want to say. Jack and I grew more and more intrigued. Something about that presence, that dark figure in the basement, seemed out of place, and the feeling that something was wrong began to follow us like a shadow. The basement neighbor's behavior kept nagging at us. At first, it was just mild curiosity, something to talk about during our nightly conversations. But as the days passed, that curiosity turned into obsession. Every time I saw that man emerging from the basement in the middle of the night, something inside me screamed that something was deeply wrong. One night, while we were in the kitchen, I once again heard the characteristic sound of the basement door opening. I looked out the window, and there he was, moving slowly, with the same hunched posture and dragging steps. It was almost like watching the same scene play out over and over again. But that night, I decided I couldn't ignore it any longer. I spoke to Jack about the unsettling feeling that had been growing inside me. "Have you noticed he never changes?" I asked Jack, trying to express what was bothering me. "He always looks the same, with the same movements, and he never comes out during the day." Jack looked at me, concern starting to creep onto his face. "Do you think he's dangerous?" he asked, though it was clear he was also uncomfortable. Maybe we should ask someone, find out more about him. The next day, we decided to talk to Mrs. Calloway, one of the building's longest-standing residents. She had lived on the floor above us since the building had been built, decades ago. If anyone knew something, it would be her. When we knocked on her door, the expression on her face when we mentioned the basement neighbor was enough to deepen our discomfort. Her eyes narrowed, and she fell silent for a moment, as if deciding what she should or shouldn't say. "He's been here a long time," she finally said, her voice low and cautious. "Too long, if you ask me." Jack and I exchanged glances, unsure of what she meant by that. "What do you mean, too long?" I asked, trying to understand what she was implying. "He was here when I moved in, and that was over 40 years ago. Back then, he already seemed different. People talked about it, but over time, they learned to ignore him. Nobody talks about him. And if you're smart, you won't want to know more either." Mrs. Calloway's tone made us uncomfortable. 40 years? That was impossible. He didn't look older than 50 or 60. How could someone live in one place for so long without aging? In the days that followed, our curiosity only grew. We started observing the neighbor more closely, each small detail becoming more disturbing. He left every night, always at the same time, and returned before dawn. There was no change in his appearance, no change in his behavior, as if time didn't affect him at all. One night, Jack and I decided to follow him. We were determined to find out where he went. Around midnight, when he left the building, we hurried to follow him from a safe distance. He walked slowly, as if carrying the weight of decades on his back. His path led to an older part of town, where the streets were poorly lit, and the houses looked as old as our building. We followed him until he entered an abandoned building. We waited outside, trying to decide what to do. We stayed there for over an hour, but he never came out. When we finally decided to leave, the discomfort had turned into certainty. That man, or whatever he was, wasn't normal. When we returned to our building, I felt something different in the air, as if the very atmosphere around us had shifted. Now, we had more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. We needed to find out the truth about the basement neighbor. In the days following our attempt to follow the neighbor to that abandoned building, the tension in our home increased. The silence that had once felt comforting now weighed heavily in the air. Jack and I were becoming more obsessed with the shadowy figure living in the basement. We had so many questions, but the answers seemed beyond our reach, hidden in the shadows of the building's history. One night, after hearing the basement door open and close once more as the neighbor left for his nightly walk, I decided we couldn't wait any longer. We had to confront him. Jack was reluctant at first, worried about what we might discover. But curiosity, and perhaps the fear of staying in the dark, led us to make a decision. We waited until he left, as usual, in the dead of night. As soon as we heard the basement door slam shut, we headed down there. The basement door had always had something sinister about it, but that night it seemed even more menacing. Every step we took toward it made the air around us feel heavier, as if we were walking against an invisible force. With trembling hands, Jack turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a concrete staircase descending into the dark depths. A faint, flickering light illuminated the way. We took a deep breath and descended. The air was thick, humid, and there was a musty odor mixed with something else. Something I couldn't identify, but that caused a knot in my stomach. When we reached the bottom of the stairs, the basement was much larger than we had imagined. It wasn't just a storage space for old, forgotten things. There was something much more disturbing. In one corner, several old boxes were stacked, some sealed with rusty chains. In the center of the room, there was a table covered with old notes and documents that seemed to date back decades. But what we found on one of the walls made my heart stop. There were old photos, faded by time, carelessly hung. In each one of them, the same man, the basement neighbor. He looked exactly the same, decade after decade, always with the same appearance. In one of the photos, dated from the 1920s, he was standing in front of the building alongside other residents. What shocked us most was that everyone else in the photo had aged and disappeared over the years, but he stayed the same. "This isn't possible," I murmured, feeling a chill run down my spine. "He's been here for nearly 100 years. Jack looked at me pale. He isn't human." Suddenly, we heard a noise behind us. The heavy sound of footsteps coming down the basement stairs. The neighbor was back, and we were trapped in his hideout. We stood frozen, our hearts racing, as the sound of the footsteps grew closer. When the basement door slammed shut, We knew there was no escape. He entered the room, his tall, gaunt figure standing out in the shadows. His face was even paler than before. But there was something else. His eyes. They seemed empty, as if there was no life left in them. The man we had seen leaving every night was no longer human. He stopped in front of us, a sinister smile spreading across his lips. You wanted to know the truth, his voice was a harsh whisper. Now you know. Somehow there was no fear in his words, only cold certainty. He was a shadow, an echo of something much older and darker. And we had been foolish enough to disturb his secret. Jack tried to move, but it felt like something was holding us there, as if the very air around us had come to life. We were paralyzed by fear and the oppressive presence of that being. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was the sound of the basement door closing again, as if sealing our fate. I don't know how we managed to get out of there. When I woke up, we were back in our apartment, with the feeling that something had changed forever. We never spoke about the basement neighbor again, and we avoided looking at that sinister door downstairs. But one thing is certain, since that night, we haven't been able to sleep peacefully. Every time the sun sets, we feel his presence watching us. We know he's still there, hiding in the shadows, waiting. And we will never be the same. When I moved into this house, I thought I had finally found the peace I'd always been looking for. It was a small, one-story home located in a quiet neighborhood in Portland, perfect for someone like me, who wanted a bit of solitude and a place to start over. The front yard was modest, with a low fence and a stone path leading up to the front door. From the outside, everything looked cozy. It was an old neighborhood, but well-kept, with tree-lined streets and not much activity at night. It was exactly what I needed. The first few weeks went by calmly. I kept myself busy with work and spent my free time exploring the city, adjusting to my new life. The nights were quiet, and the silence helped me unwind after long days. It was only after a few days that things started to change. The first time the doorbell rang was on an ordinary night. I was almost ready to go to bed when the sudden sound made me jump out of bed. I glanced at the clock on my nightstand, midnight, on the dot. My first reaction was surprise, thinking it might be a neighbor needing something. I put on my robe and walked to the door. When I opened it, I found nothing. The yard was empty, the street dimly lit by the weak glow of the streetlights, and a cold wind blew gently. There was no one there. I stood in the doorway for a few seconds, waiting for someone to appear, but the silence continued. I closed the door, thinking maybe it was just a mistake or some bored teenager playing pranks. The next night, the doorbell rang again. Midnight, once more. This time, I hurried to answer, but just like before, no one was there. I started feeling uneasy. I was certain I had heard the sound. It couldn't have been my imagination. But why would someone ring the doorbell and run off so quickly? The following nights were the same. The doorbell rang, always at midnight, and each time I opened the door, there was no one. I began to wonder if it was some kind of prank, or if I was being watched. The routine started to bother me. My thoughts revolved around those nightly visits, and the feeling that something was wrong began to grow inside me. I called a neighbor, Mr. Hudson, who had lived next door for years, to see if he had noticed anything strange. He laughed and said it was probably some kid from the neighborhood playing tricks. But there was something uneasy in his voice, as if he was choosing not to delve into the matter. That mystery began to consume me. Every night, I would wait for the doorbell, and it would always ring, without fail, at exactly midnight. I decided I needed to confront whatever was happening. Deep down, there was something sinister about the precise repetition of the sound, the way every night played out like a ritual. So, on one of those nights, determined when the clock struck midnight and the sound echoed through the house, I ran to the door and opened it. This time, I didn't wait. I looked out into the yard, and for the first time, I saw a figure. It was far off, almost at the edge of the sidewalk, a still shadow watching the house. My heart raced. I tried to shout to ask who it was, but the words got stuck in my throat. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching me from a distance. And then, as if it were a reflection of the night wind, it disappeared into the darkness. I quickly shut the door, my heart still pounding, trying to process what I had just seen. From that moment, I knew this wasn't just a prank. After that night, everything changed. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure I had seen in the distance. This wasn't some neighborhood joke. Whoever or whatever it was seemed to be watching me in a way I had never felt before. And the strangest part of all was the precision of the timing. Every night, exactly at midnight, the doorbell would ring. I decided I had to do something more than just open the door and wait for the figure to return. I resolved to install security cameras around the house. It wasn't something I had ever thought about doing, but the situation was starting to consume me. If someone was watching me, I needed to know who it was. I bought cameras and set them up in the most strategic places. One focused on the front yard, another on the entryway, and one near the door. As I adjusted the cameras, a chill ran down my spine. It was as if something had been watching me the whole time, even during the day. The house, which had once felt welcoming, now gave me a constant sense of unease. It was as if the presence that appeared at night was always lurking, even when I couldn't see it. That night, I prepared myself for what was coming. As the clock neared midnight, my heart began to pound. I sat on the living room couch, looking at the camera feed on my phone, waiting for the doorbell to ring again. I already knew it would happen. And as expected, at the stroke of midnight, the sound echoed through the house. I quickly looked at the screen on my phone, and there it was. The figure, standing in front of the house, just as I had seen the night before. This time, it was closer, almost at the sidewalk. I couldn't make out any details, just a vaguely human shadow, like a shapeless figure. A shiver ran down my spine. I tried to breathe deeply, but fear was starting to take hold of me. What was it? And why was it coming to me every night? I watched the figure for a few more minutes. It didn't move. It just stood there, motionless, as if it were waiting for something. I decided not to go outside that night. I didn't have the courage to open the door again. Whatever it was, I wasn't ready to confront it up close. I stayed up all night, watching the camera feed, waiting for the figure to disappear. Eventually, it slowly moved away, as if dissolving into the darkness of the street. The brief sense of relief wasn't enough to calm my nerves. I knew it would come back. Tomorrow, and the next day, always at midnight. In the days that followed, I kept watching the camera recordings, and every night, the scene repeated itself. The doorbell, the figure standing outside, always still, always watching me. I tried to gather the courage to confront it, but something inside me told me I shouldn't. There was something deeply wrong, something I wasn't ready to understand. Then, one of those nights, I noticed something different in the recordings. That night, I decided to review the footage from the previous day, hoping to find some clue. When I fast-forwarded to the moment the figure appeared, my heart stopped for a second. The camera, which I thought would show a stranger, revealed something much more disturbing. The visitor was me. I was there, standing in front of my own house, exactly where the figure had always been. The same clothes, the same hair, everything identical. Whoever or whatever it was seemed to be an exact copy of me, watching me from outside. I didn't know what to think. How was this possible? Was I dreaming? Was it some kind of illusion? I rewound the video and watched again. There was no mistake. That figure outside was me. My body shook with fear, and a knot formed in my stomach. What was happening? Who or what was that thing that imitated me so perfectly? As I tried to process what I was seeing, the clock struck midnight. And for the first time, the doorbell rang without me needing to check the cameras to know that, outside, I was waiting. I sat frozen on the couch. The doorbell had just rung again. The clock showed midnight, and I knew, with a terrible certainty, that outside stood someone identical to me, waiting. After seeing the video from the security camera, everything changed. The idea that I was being watched by an exact copy of myself, a distorted version, terrified me more than anything I could have imagined. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Facing it head-on was the only way out, no matter how much the fear consumed me. I took a deep breath and stood up, my legs trembling under the weight of my decision. I had to see it up close. I needed to know what it really was. With trembling hands, I walked to the door. My heart pounded in my chest, and the house seemed quieter than ever, as if the very air was holding its breath with me. I placed my hand on the doorknob, hesitated for a second, and in a moment of pure courage, opened the door. There it was. Standing in the yard, the figure stared back at me. It was like looking into a distorted mirror, but not entirely. Although it was identical to me in appearance, something was deeply wrong. The expression on the face of my copy was cold, devoid of any emotion, its eyes hollow and dark. It stared at me as if it was waiting for something, as if it knew I had finally gathered the courage to confront it. I tried to speak, but my voice came out shaky. Who are you? It didn't respond. It just continued to watch me, motionless, as if waiting for a reaction. Then, slowly, it took a step forward. The stone path in the yard made a faint sound under its feet, and my heart raced. There was no logic in trying to understand. This was something beyond my comprehension. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. Every movement was deliberate, controlled, as if it were imitating a version of me that had never existed. When it took another step toward me, a wave of terror washed over me. Something inside me screamed to shut the door, lock everything, and run. But I couldn't move. I was trapped in the confrontation with my own image, feeling that somehow my fate was being decided in that moment. I didn't know what would happen if it reached me, but I knew I didn't want to find out. It was now just a few feet away from me, its eyes fixed on mine, and that's when I saw it. A small smile began to form on its face, but it wasn't a human smile. It was a forced, distorted gesture, as if it were mimicking something it had never truly felt. My body reacted before my mind could process what was happening. I slammed the door shut, locking it quickly. The sound echoed through the house, and I stood there, panting, pressed against the door, my heart racing as if it would burst from my chest. I rushed to the security cameras again, fear and adrenaline consuming me. When I looked at the screen, the terror inside me grew even stronger. The figure was no longer in the yard. The camera now showed me. I was outside the house, standing in the exact spot where the figure had been before. My reflection, the other me, was there, staring directly at the door I had just slammed shut. How was this possible? I was here, inside the house, but I was also out there. My eyes were glued to the screen, trying to make sense of what was happening, and then I realized. The figure outside started moving, slowly, toward the living room window. I knew it was watching me, and the panic increased with every second. I didn't know what it was, but I was certain it wanted to take my place, or something far worse. I rushed to the windows, pulling the curtains shut and locking every door. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't help. This wasn't a normal person. It wasn't something I could stop with locks and curtains. Something was coming for me, and I no longer knew how to escape. I sat on the floor of the living room, pressed against the wall, listening to the deafening silence of the house. There was no longer the sound of the doorbell. There was nothing but the overwhelming fear that, at any moment, I would be inside. I closed my eyes, trying to control the rising dread, and then I heard a whisper, faint, almost imperceptible, coming from somewhere inside the house. I am you.